Welcome to another International Trade podcast by Patrick Holtberg. Today we will consider what happens or the impact of international trade if you have two factors of production, capital and labor, and those two factors are perfectly mobile between two industries. Once upon a time there was a perfect world with two great nations, America and China. The two nations were very similar to each other. They had access to identical technology. Their citizens had identical preferences, and they had identical resources, capital and labor. In fact, the only difference between America and China was that America had a lot of capital relative to workers, while China had a lot of workers relative to capital. Both America and China produced and consumed two goods, beer and food. To produce beer required many units of capital and only a few workers, while the production of food required many workers and few machines. In the beginning of our story, America and China did not interact with each other. In their own separate parts of this perfect world, America was proud to be capital abundant, and China was proud to be labor abundant. Everywhere signs proclaimed their abundance. The KL ratio in America was much greater than the K over L ratio in China. Both nations liked to consume both beer and food, but the production of beer was capital intensive, and the production of food was labor intensive. That is, it took more capital per worker in the beer industry than in the food industry. Given that America and China had identical technology and identical preferences, their difference in factor abundance led to different factor prices. The country has a lot of workers found their workers to be cheap, and the country with a lot of capital found capital to be cheap. So therefore the wage rate to the rental rate in America was much greater than the wage rate to the rental rate in China. Now these differences in price of labor, W, and the price of capital, R, meant that the goods produced in these two great nations were priced differently. Capital abundant America, where capital was relatively cheap, produced beer relatively cheaply. The labor abundant China, where wages were relatively low, produced food relatively cheaply. So we had that the relative price of beer in America was much lower than the relative price of beer in China. And of course, the relative price of food in China would have been lower than the relative price of food in America. One day, the beer industry in America realized that if they sold their beer in China, they would be much better off. They could get a lot more food for every beer they sold if they traded with China. And that way, they would be able to consume more of everything. At the same time, food producers in China realized that if they sold their food in America, they would be better off too. They too would be able to consume more of everything. Slowly, the two nations decided to open up for some trade. Sure enough, America ended up exporting beer to China, and China exported food to America. From far, far away, two great economists from Sweden noticed and wrote a paper to explain this pattern of trade. They called it the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. At first, everyone in America's beer industry was happy. Both workers and capital owners rejoiced. Unfortunately, the same was not true for America's food producers. However, as trade took place, the relative price of beer to food began to change. And with a change in prices, everything changed. Everything turned out to be different. Trade meant that the relative price of beer increased in America. And this led America to produce more beer and less food. Of course, to produce more beer, resources had to move from the food industry to the beer industry. But the food industry had used many, many workers and only a few units of capital, while the production of beer needed lots and lots of capital, only a few workers. America found itself with an excess demand for capital and an excess supply of labor. And suddenly the price of capital started to increase while wages began to fall. And the WR ratio in America declined. Suddenly, workers and capital owners in America received similar wages and similar return to capital as workers and capital owners in China. And at the same time, in China, the opposite turned out to be going on. In China, labor found themselves earning a higher wage, while capital owners in China saw their return to go down. Now, a famous economist in America, Stolper-Samuelson, noticed this change, and he named this phenomenon the factor price equalization theorem. And according to Professor Samuelson, workers and capital owners will earn the same return no matter where they live. As the relative price of labor to capital changed, as workers became relatively cheaper compared to capital, the American producers of beer and food decided to use fewer machines and more labor. This was all according to the principle of substitution. Suddenly, the capital labor ratio in the beer industry went down, and the capital labor ratio in the food industry went down. Suddenly, there were many more workers using the machines, and therefore the machines became more productive in both industries. At the same time, workers did not have access to as many machines anymore, and workers therefore became less productive, again, in both industries. We found ourselves in a situation where the marginal product of capital in the beer industry increased, the marginal product of capital in the food industry increased, while the marginal product of labor in the beer industry and the marginal product of labor in the food industry decreased. Now, in this perfect world, all markets were perfectly competitive, and therefore the real return to any factor was equal to its marginal product. And therefore the real return to labor went down in terms of both goods, and the real return to capital went up in terms of both goods. Now labor, no matter in which industry they worked, were unhappy. They were not able to drink as much beer and eat as much food as they once were able to. Many workers were angry, both with capital owners and with the workers who originally worked in the beer industry. Why had they sold their goods to China? Capital owners were suddenly happy, drinking lots of beer, eating lots of food. Even capital owners who originally worked in the food industry were now better off. They resented the constant complaints from workers. Trade is good, they said. Two American economists noticed these changes in income distribution, and they put a name to these changes. They called it the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and it said, with full employment both before and after trade, a change in the relative commodity prices increases in terms of both goods the reward of the factor used intensively in the production of that good whose price has risen, and will reduce in terms of both goods the reward of the other factor, provided that both goods are produced. Now, both Stolper and Samuelson soon realized that no one could remember this complicated statement, so they simplified it to become: owners of a country's abundant factor gain from trade, while owners of a country's scarce factor lose from trade. This is our conclusion in the model with two factors of production where they are both perfectly mobile. That is, we consider this to be the outcome in the long run. Thank you.